Welcome to episode 2 of QueerTrek, a Tricorder Transmissions LGBTQ community podcast. My name is Heather, and I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Marty. Hi, Marty. How are you doing tonight?
Hi, Heather. I'm doing well. Thank you. It's great to be back for another episode of QueerTrek. Since episode 1 has launched, we've had nothing but great, amazing, incredible feedback. So I'm really excited to be recording another episode. How are you doing?
Following up with that, the feedback that we got made my heart super happy.
Yeah.
And it felt really good to get so much positive feedback. That's our goal, is to make people happy. So keep it coming. Constructive criticism too. We're open to everything.
Oh, yeah.
And remember, this is your show. So on the heels of that, quickly, before we introduce our guest, I just want to go over what this show is. QueerTrek is an LGBTQ community empowered Star Trek podcast where topics come from listeners. So that's you and your suggestions. Each show, Marty and I will be joined by guests from the LGBTQ community who will share their stories while discussing the subjects they choose within the scope of Star Trek's 52-year history. We'll have discussions ranging from personal stories, episode examinations, characters and themes in Star Trek, all from a queer perspective. If you would like to submit a topic idea or you'd like to be a guest on QueerTrek, you can reach us by email at queertrek@thetricordertransmissions.com. On Twitter, we're at QueerTrekPod, or you can use the submission form on our website at queertrek.thetricordertransmissions.com. We've gotten quite a few suggestions for topics and guests down the road, so keep them coming. Again, this podcast is all about you. We host it, but it's yours. So we look forward to hearing from you. Super quick, Marty, do you want to tell people about Patreon?
Absolutely. If you are enjoying this show or any of the other shows on the Tricorder Transmissions Network, we encourage you to go visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. This is a way that you can help support the show and the network. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain exclusive access to unedited episodes, early release episodes, exclusive interviews, and even patron-only chats that we do about once every other month or so. The last one we did recently was a lot of fun. So yeah, join our Patreon at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions.
I missed our last patron hangout, and I'm super bummed about it. I always feel so envious. Like after I listen, y'all are like tweeting at each other. Yeah, it's such a great time, and I'm sitting here like, but I had to do this. I had to go here.
You'll get to one of them. You'll get to.
I've only made one so far. But yeah. So speaking of patrons, one of our patrons, our first QueerTrek specific patron, is joining us tonight. Felicity, welcome to QueerTrek. We're so glad to have you here.
Hi.
Yay! So I'm just going to be super frank about why you're here. We're in a group together on the social media somewhere, and you made some comments about a couple Star Trek episodes in which the subject of sex and gender pop up. And when I see something like that, that says to me, we need to amplify your voice. It's one thing to be in a group and say, make a few comments, and they were positive, good comments. It's something else to be able to give you a platform to talk about those things. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, I guess, to start off with? And we can kind of go into the comments that you made and go with the discussion from there.
Sure. I am a 30-year-old trans woman. I have only been transitioning for a couple years now. Actually, I'll be at my 2-year mark at the end of this month, October 2018. So by some people's standards, I'm still baby trans. But
is that a real term, baby trans?
That is a real term. It is more coined by trans women than trans men who frequently try to avoid infantilization, whereas trans women tend to swing the opposite direction as a rebellion against their socialization as hypermasculine. So it creates this sort of dichotomy. It's very it's hard for some people. Like I don't usually get in for the infantilization. Some people are super about that life, though, and that's fine for them. There's nothing wrong with that. Sorry I got derailed here a little bit.
No, you're fine.
And then something else about me, I do love Star Trek. My father introduced me to Star Trek when I was little. And I got off of it for a long time. Then I got back onto it. Then I got off of it. Then I got onto it. And now it's my favorite show. I love watching Discovery. Tilly is my favorite character. I can go on and on about Janeway and theories that she is a trans woman and all kinds of things. Mostly derived from a couple like small lines that I cherry picked because that's how we do. Yeah.
And that's, that's cool. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this show is that, not everyone sees everyone else's perspective. And so it's all about queer perspectives and what we each take from Star Trek, how we interpret it, how we internalize it, how it becomes important to us. I'd say it like our friend Jim over at Trek Ranks, there are no wrong answers. Like there's no wrong answers in how we live our lives. This podcast and this community is about acceptance. And so we may have to have you back to talk about Janeway and those quotes that you pull out more specifically.
I love it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Or maybe it will come up tonight. I don't know. So the comments that you made in the group that we're in, like, I don't want to, I'm not bringing you on just to retaliate what was done in another group or anything like that.
Right.
It's just that as we know, not everyone understand certain subjects from all perspectives, especially in the queer community.
Right.
And so some of the topics that came up there was a general perhaps misunderstanding of what sex is, what gender is, and then how sex and gender pertain to the trans community and how misinterpretations of them can really harm trans identity. So do you want to talk a little bit about, I think some of the episodes in which they've come up have been the Outcast and Cogenitor, especially with the subjects of third genders and everything else. So do you want to talk a little bit about why it's so important, maybe, how you interpret sex, how you interpret gender, and go from there?
Okay. So sex and gender are typically used colloquially. They're used interchangeably to describe the way in one of the ways in which people interact with the world through their identity. Oftentimes, this is linked to sexual activity as well, because it is the most common means for heterosexual reproduction. And even homosexual reproduction is often identified using sex as the foundation for this. Gender is a lot larger and more complex of a topic. I couldn't hope to go into the whole thing here. And I can only give you my brief understanding of it from what I studied in school as a gender and identities major, and also as my own personal experience as a trans woman. Gender is usually it's masculine and feminine. However, it's absolutely this gradient where you'll have women that present masculine but identify as female, and men who present feminine and identify as male, and everything in between. And all of these are okay and good. And that is frequently what's confusing to people, is that there's this question of, okay, so I want to accept you, but what do I call you? And Riker struggles with this personal pronoun question as well, in much the way that cishet people have done in the 90s. He asks, should I call you it?
Yeah.
Because that's rude in my culture. So he at least acknowledges that it is rude in human culture to call people it, because that objectifies them. With someone's pronouns, it's remarkably easy. People have found to just ask and it's usually polite. Most people will not get offended. That's probably the biggest and most important thing. And if you are a trans person, I do encourage you not to be offended if somebody asks you what your pronouns are. This also ties into this whole huge notion of something called passing. Trans people often feel a need to pass as one gender or another, and this is something that is a pressure that comes upon us from a cisgendered society. Especially that wants to easily categorize us. And it's a particularly harmful, that sort of cis heteronormativity, I can speak, is damaging to both trans people and cis people in situations where a cis person may not appear in a gender conforming way. There are certainly women that identify as women that were assigned female gender at birth that they keep their hair short, they wear jeans, but they've been assaulted in women's restrooms. They've been denied access to the bus using their bus pass in certain places. I believe I read about it was Boston. And the same kind of thing happens to trans people as well. And so one of the things that I like to point out is that pressure to pass as masculine or feminine, to adhere to these gender norms, is harmful to everybody. It is especially harmful to trans people, but it is harmful to everybody. That's a kind of a nutshell argument, I think. Very nutshell.
It's awesome. And we can expand upon it should we desire to. So I delved into the interwebs to find some good resources for people. And there is a website called genderspectrum.org, and it's all about understanding gender and connecting people and everything else. So they've got a really great website. I don't want to break down the entire page here. But they basically explain that, people tend to use the term sex and gender interchangeably, as you just said, and that when there's a baby, it's either male or female, although we also do have intersex people. So even in that, sex itself is not a binary thing. In some cases, intersex people do tend to choose male or female. They may or may not have surgery to do so. But just alone in nature, sex is not binary. Biological sex is not always a binary thing. And I think that it's important to remind people about that.
Absolutely. Shout out to all those awesome non-binary folks out there.
Absolutely. So then we have the subject of gender. And again, we tend to want to define gender as male or female and as a social construct, like it's something that we learn over time, like a nature versus nurture type of thing. And I don't necessarily agree with that either. But the Gender Spectrum website defines dimensions of gender, and they talk about body and our experience in our own body, how society genders bodies, our identity, which is our internal sense of self, whether we feel that we're male, female, both, neither, whatever. And that's something that I think is so important to help the world understand, is that we don't have to fit into a definition of male or female. It's a spectrum. It's a kaleidoscope, like I said in our first episode. And so I hope that over time in the future, we don't see it in Star Trek's future, but in our own future that we make, that we will see a broader spectrum of acceptance of identity. And then the last dimension of gender, the gender spectrum describes, is expression. And that's just how we express ourselves and our gender to the world, how our family perceives it, how others interact with us and such. And I'm not going to read the whole website here, but it gives a pretty good explanation and breakdown of those three dimensions, and then talks about how gender is also different from sexual orientation, and that our sexual orientation is not the same thing as gender, and that's something else that gets confused a lot. Yeah. So I didn't know if either of you two had any comments or wanted to expand upon any of that.
Really briefly, I just want to say that none of that like anything that you just said was radical as a concept.
Yep.
None of it is.
No, not at all.
Be treated like it.
Yeah. And it always fascinates me when people who sadly don't, not that they even don't know people in the LGBTQ plus community, but they can't grasp or like even have a basic understanding. It's difficult for me to understand that they don't understand, if that makes sense, because it's to me it's just like, yes, it all makes sense. I don't know. I'm blabbering about stuff.
I think that makes a certain amount of sense, and there's certainly a lot of frustration, and I would wonder, because I've only identified as queer for as long as I've identified as a trans woman, which is pretty late in my life, but I wouldn't wonder that that's an experience that's common among many, if not all, queer people.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't given Marty a chance to speak at all.
That's okay. I mean, the only thing that I have to say about it regarding the website and all that stuff is like, this is all stuff that I've learned over time. Like I didn't, when I came out, I had like transgender was not even on my radar at the time. Like, and I was a part of the community then. So it's only been recently that I've started to really learn about it and understand it. I wanted to know more about what they go through, because I personally don't understand that, but I want to understand.
I think a lot of the trouble, statistically, typically, is shown to come from this concept of passing. To give a more clear definition, passing is when you fit into the standards of looking as one would define in your culture as a man, or one would define in your culture as a woman. To achieve this, various things are done by trans people. Trans men wear binders. They have special stuff that they wear, or surgeries they can get for bottom surgery. Likewise, trans women will tuck. They will get surgery as well. They both tend to take hormones. One of the frustrating things about testosterone is that it is much more potent than estrogen as far as the physical effects.
Yeah.
So a lot of trans men will take testosterone for a week and report that their voices dropped and they're getting little wispy whiskers, and trans women will take estrogen for a week and report that they're a little bit weepier, and that's about it. So, life is hard, but but ultimately, the biggest thing, if you're questioning and you're not sure, is you can usually try. Usually, a lot of informed consent clinics will allow people to test hormones for a week, a month or so, and that lets you see how your body reacts to it, how your experience changes. And for trans men and trans women, they tend to be calmer, they tend to be happier, they tend to be more relaxed. These are all things that will typically happen on or for the hormones that align to a gender they identify with. Now, this covers if you are a trans woman or if you're a trans man. Non-binary people may need specific medication depending on how they feel in their body. If their body naturally produces estrogen and they're fine with that, then they'll just keep producing estrogen and they're not going to take anything else. They might. You don't have to dress or appear a certain way to be non-binary. Same thing if your body produces testosterone naturally and you identify as non-binary. You don't need to take estrogen hormones in order to grow breasts in order to be non-binary. You are non-binary regardless of what your physical body is, because that's an expression of your gender identity. And that NBs in that, NB being short for non-binary, have that the most difficult in regards to people making pat judgments about them when they see them. They're the ones most often to get misgendered, to get sirred or ma'amed at the grocery store, and that has varying degrees of effect on them. Some people they don't mind that much. Some people, it's a big deal.
Yeah. I do just want to pull up. So, and you can give me your insight on how you feel about, I'm sure, Felicity, you've seen I don't know if I can put it up, the umbrella graphic with the. Yes. Okay.
Excellent.
And we'll put this in show notes so that everyone can see it. But basically, imagine a beautiful rainbow umbrella that says transgender. So transgender at this point, because I think that a lot of cis people don't realize that transgender itself is not just a binary phrase. It doesn't just mean trans woman or trans man.
Right.
So you have the big umbrella of transgender, and then below that, you split into binary and non-binary. So, of course, under binary, you've got trans man and trans woman. And then non-binary, you have many, many things. We have genderqueer, we have demisexual, gender fluid, bigender, agender, and more. And so I'm curious, Felicity, like you seem super supportive of this. I'm always curious as to how trans men and trans women feel, because originally it was a binary term and now it's turning into something much more. So I'm just always curious, what everyone's reaction to that is. And you seem supportive of it, but I don't want to assume.
Yeah, there's absolutely trans people out there that don't believe that there is non-binary as a category. I cannot speak to their experience, why they think that.
Yeah.
Especially having gone through such intense scrutiny of my own gender, because I vividly remember, it was 2 years ago, but I still remember this question of, do I identify as a man? Do I identify as a woman? They both kind of suck. Maybe I should be neither. But they're both kind of awesome. So maybe I should pick one. So there's this little bit of gender fluidity in my brain that allows me to sort of look at things that way. But I have felt more comfortable identifying as a woman. So that's sort of where I sit. Yeah. There's so many different categories of gender. I remember I got this pamphlet recently. I wish I had it on hand. I don't. It's an 8.5 by 11 pamphlet that somebody had put together that had 30, 40, 50 different genders in it.
Wow.
And it was amazing. But as far as where did non-binary people seem to suddenly come from, it's much in the same way that Marty was talking about, how when he came out in the scene, there weren't really there were trans people. There have been trans people the whole time. We've always been there. And just like that, non-binary people have always been there. And as trans people have, binary trans people have gotten voices, so too have non-binary trans people started to get the inkling of a voice, and they really need a bigger voice. And so if you find a listener, hopefully that's non-binary, hopefully they'll come on and talk a little bit more about that.
I think our next episode is going to be.
Yep.
Oh, I look forward to it. I'm so excited.
Yes. Super. No, that's our goal. Everybody. To me, and I don't remember if I said this in the first episode, and it's just become very apparent to me that the world that I want to live in is one where we can all be ourselves, save people that are just full of hate, right? Pass on those people. But I want to live in a world where everyone, and I don't like to use the word authentic anymore because it's so incredibly overused that I feel like, but where everyone can just be their authentic self, with no judgment, prejudice. That's the world that I want to live in, and I hope that we get to see that world one day. And that means that, whoever you are. And I think, what was it, when I was watching the Outcast, at the end of the Outcast, Soren who was the agender character that identified as a woman, she makes a big speech at the end. Oh, it's so powerful.
It is.
It really is.
I am tired of lies. I am female. I was born that way. I have had those feelings, those longings, all of my life. It is not unnatural. I am not sick because I feel this way. I do not need to be helped. I do not need to be cured. What I need, and what all of those who are like me need, is your understanding and your compassion. We have not injured you in any way. And yet we are scorned and attacked. And all because we are different. What we do is no different from what you do. We talk and laugh. We complain about work. And we wonder about growing old. We talk about our families, and we worry about the future. And we cry with each other when things seem hopeless. All of the loving things that you do with each other, that is what we do. And for that we are called misfits and deviants and criminals. What right do you have to punish us? What right do you have to change us? What makes you think you can dictate how people love each other?
For all that people want to say about the Outcast and where it succeeds and where it fails, I feel that one speech,
it makes a whole episode.
Yeah.
It absolutely does.
It's powerful, and for me, as a queer person, it speaks for me, and I know it may not speak for all queer people, but at the end of the day, it's like we all love the same. Like, we love like you do.
Absolutely.
And everything in that is just, I want to live in the world where, love is love, and we're getting there, hopefully.
I think that speech is such a powerful queer speech, and it really is. And you can apply it if you're queer, if you're gay, if you're lesbian, if you're bi, if you're pan. You can apply it if you're trans. You can apply it if you're any of a number of categories that fall under that queer umbrella. And it's so beautiful in that versatility. I think what's most interesting, and I'm going to provide a little bit more context, because Soren describes earlier in the episode to Riker how their species came to be non-binary. Mm-hmm. Because that's essentially what they describe. They are a non-binary. They are described as androgynous, which is the 90s word for non-binary, but that is what it is now, as we call it non-binary. She said that they used to have binary gender system. They used to have binary sexes like human beings, but they quote unquote evolved out of it, which suggests the same kind of evolution that Gene Roddenberry described for human beings, not a physical evolution, but a social evolution. In this case, the Janai society has evolved into one that chooses not to see gender, which from a 90s feminist standpoint is a very powerful position. However, they use that powerful position instead of as a good thing for gender nonconforming individuals. They use it as a sort of bludgeon to say this is what happens if we let non-conforming people go run wild, because their society punishes you when you try to have a gender. And Soren, although she was born female and identifies female, is absolutely a trans woman within the context of her society, because her society's norm is non-binary and she identifies as female. So the eventual punishment, which is conversion therapy, that they give to her, is indicative of it's almost, this episode could be interpreted almost as a look at what happens if you let SJWs go too far. And that's a very scary thing to have as this sort of weird subtext on what is otherwise a very powerful and beautiful episode.
Speaking of the conversion therapy, there was another moment with Soren when she's talking to Riker in the shuttlecraft, I believe, when they're repairing it. And she kind of has this like coming out moment to him where she describes one of her friends from school who identified as male and how they took him away.
I remember when I was very young, before I knew what I was, there was a rumor at my school that one of the students preferred a gender, in that case male. The children started making fun of him, and every day they were more cruel. They could tell he was afraid, and somehow that seemed to encourage them. One morning in class, he appeared, bleeding and in ripped clothes. He said he had fallen down. And of course, the school authorities found out and took him away and gave him psychotactic treatments. When he came back, he stood in front of the whole school and told us how happy he was now that he had been cured. After that, I realized how dangerous it was to be different. And once I got older and knew what I was terrified. I have had to live with that fear ever since.
I thought that was another like big moment of the show. I thought the episode focused too much on conversion therapy. It shouldn't have been about that, you know.
Yeah.
I agree. One of the problems that I find when you have cis writers that are writing about trans issues, and this, I can say this is true of the Outcast. I can say this is true of the Cogenitor. In particular, this is one of the things that bugged me about one of the Orville's early episodes. Was that cis people that do not specifically understand it. And I know that there are cis people that do, because they teach gender and identity topics. Cis people that don't understand it inevitably end up writing about something else. Like Cogenitor is really more about sex trafficking than it is about the third gender.
Right.
And the Outcast, like Marty pointed out, is more about conversion therapy than it is about androgynous people.
Right.
And that episode of the Orville was more about several things that are, off topic.
I find it really interesting that, the Outcast was written to be an allegory for homosexuality. And I think now, and I've heard this from other people, is that it passes more as a trans episode than anything else.
In time, absolutely.
And I think that, in that way, it stands up. Like, I think it's still a powerful episode. And I think that those episodes with Soren and Riker in the shuttle, because there were two of them. And the first one is where they're talking about like the gender and how gender came to be. And my biggest thing with all of these episodes with the Outcast Cogenitor, I think the host is that they just use sex and gender interchangeably. Which is a no. And so that bothers me then and there. But both of those scenes, I think we're very powerful and relatable to most people in the queer community. You know, there's discussion about, well, even though it's an androgynous society, all of the actors were women.
And Jonathan Frakes has famously said in many, many conventions that he thought it was a mistake casting Soren as a woman actress. He felt it should have been a man portraying himself identifying as a woman.
Yep. And then you've got good old Rick Berman saying that having Riker engaged in passionate kisses with a male actor might have been a little unpalatable to viewers. Oh my.
I don't think he understood Star Trek fans. He hasn't been reading the slash fiction that goes his way back to
seriously. And, you know, Berman and Braga, you know, have and others, male writers in general, for Star Trek have received a lot of criticism because of this lack up until Star Trek Discovery of true LGBTQ representation. And, you know, as we were saying, the Outcast winds up ending in conversion therapy. And that's not the ending that, you know, any of us wanted.
I think it's important to point out that The Outcast in particular was written by Jerry Taylor, who's a female writer. And she became one of the producers, I think, later on
Voyager, at least.
Voyager and DS9, and it looks like it also says TNG here a little bit. Oh, it says writer and producer. So, but yeah, she wrote for Star Trek for a long time. And, it looked like she was often tasked to write these episodes that were supposed to be a little bit more edgy in terms of sexuality. And I think that probably for her time, she did what she thought was her due diligence.
Right.
And this is one of those weird situations where it's easy for us to look back at the past and say, but couldn't they have done better?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something that, it's something that I have heard a lot, is that really none of these episodes pre-Discovery succeeded.
Yeah.
And you know, none of them accurately represent anyone from the LGBTQ community. There we go. But I still think that they're valuable in their own right. And before I forget to mention this, so I'm going to give a shout out to the podcast Women at Work. They're over on the Roddenberry Network. They are one of the only Star Trek podcasts that I feel does a great job of providing queer representation in their hosts, and then talking about LGBTQ plus issues in their shows. And I went back and listened to their recap of The Outcast, and I hate to pull content from their show, but I'm doing this simply out of appreciation. They do a great job, so please go listen to their recap of The Outcast. But one of the things that came from their discussion of the episode, they reached out for listener feedback, and there was a cis male listener who said that because of the conversion therapy part of this episode, he realized that he had been wrong in judging and condemning queer people. And it might have been specifically, you know, gay or lesbian people. I'm going to use queer because I don't remember specifically, but it took that dialogue around what happened, that discussion, to really hit home for that one person. And I'm sorry, but if that episode changed one person from hating or disliking or not supporting the queer community to at least beginning to understand or regret that, then that's a win for me. And that stuff is important to talk about. And it's something that I really want to do with QueerTrek and with our perspectives, is help explain how, even though like these, 4 or 5 episodes of Star Trek that are somewhat queer representative, even though they don't always succeed at what we want, they are succeeding in some ways, and the queer community is still finding positivity and finding representation there. So I think that's important to point out. And again, shout out to Women at Work. And And I hope they don't mind that I just shared that from their podcast. I just thought it was worth sharing.
Definitely relevant.
Do we have any other comments about the Outcast since
you brought up someone who had seen the light, as it were, by watching that episode, you can even see that in the episode with Worf. Because in the beginning of the episode of the poker game, he's like, I don't understand it. I don't care to learn about it, like whatever. But then he sees that his friend is like going through something and he's just like, hey, I'm here for you if you need me. Like, I want to help. Like, what can I do?
Worf tends to get used for good things like that, which is interesting because his character tends to have like one attitude, which is just stick in the mud. But
that was something I noticed in that episode. It's just he kind of came around by the end of the episode. So
yeah, I think he was definitely used like just to provide that perspective.
Yeah.
Because like, when has Worf ever been sexist? There's a patriarchy within the Klingon culture, but I think somewhere previously, like Worf even talks about how much he respects strong Klingon women.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting too, because like the Klingon women are supposed to bite the men that they find that they're interested in. And that's a big power move. That's not something that weak women do. And the Klingon Empire is very much about strength. And so I don't think that he thinks of Klingon women as weak necessarily, as much as he's seen this frailty. And I wouldn't wonder that that's something that he learned on Earth watching, because there's another episode where he talks about why he is so restrained, and it's because he accidentally hurt someone like playing soccer or something when he was a kid.
Yeah.
And I think that's
I think they wrote a book about that one too.
Oh, you'll have to cover it on Reading Trek.
Yeah.
So Worf. It was just weird. It was a weird thing. But definitely, again, I think that's just kind of where you see the writers and shining through. And my thought, like when I see, that if this episode is written by Jerry Taylor, I still wind up seeing these male perspectives and male influences, and I wonder if sometimes in the writing room, even some of these things get lost. I know that at one point Riker was supposed to be asking Nor, the head Janai person, how is it that Soren has no choice about her sexual orientation? And that got cut. I guess, let's see, Nor was explaining to Riker that the Janai are by all measurements an enlightened race. And Riker asked, then how is it that Soren has no choice, being so enlightened at that point?
Yeah.
Would have been interesting to have Gene Roddenberry weigh in on the interpretation here. I think the final comment I have about this is after Soren's speech, Nor goes back and is talking to Riker and says, you see, Commander, on this world, everyone wants to be normal.
It's so painful.
And I just...
And that's where the whole episode kind of crumbles.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Riker at least comes back with she is normal.
Yeah.
Which is just the right answer. But that comes right after that big, powerful speech. And that's really, it's sort of ultimately playing into the trope of like the tragic queer person.
Yeah.
Especially because Soren is queer coded. She has to die, or the effective character of Soren, the female, has to die in order to be dramatic enough for the episode, in order to get people to change their minds. They did the same thing to Dr. Culber in Discovery, and it's infuriating.
Yep.
If you're a writer out there, you don't need to kill your queer characters. You don't need to let them live.
I'm like laughing, and it's not that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's a pretty consistent trope across all of the episodes.
I've even noticed it in the novels a couple times.
Yeah, it came up in one of the Discovery novels, even
the Dayton Ward novel.
Yep, and you talked to him about that, which was good. But moving the host, which we may or may not talk about here, at the end of the host, that's our first appearance of the Trill, and Dr. Crusher basically falls in love with Odon, who is the host for the Trill, but she doesn't know, and Odon winds up in an accident, and they have to find another host for the Trill, and so he's in Riker for a little while. Again, Riker's like the star of everything. But by the end of it, they get a new host. That new host is a woman, and as we said earlier, at that point, or maybe not, as we said in the pre-discussion, that Crusher, she's not attracted to that woman, and again, there's this tragic end because they can't be together, even though there's a discussion and a confession that Dr. Crusher loves Odon, loves the personality, not necessarily the physical body, but they can't be together. And then the same thing happens in Rejoined, with Dax and Lenara Khan. Again, they can't be together. And sure, someone could argue that that's just a function of episodic Star Trek, and that even though DS9 was largely serialized, we can't have those, the continuity, have those characters come back. But it's pretty much everywhere, even in Cogenitor, where at the end she commits suicide. Yeah, it's extremely frustrating, and it's definitely one place where Star Trek fails the queer community, despite the power of these episodes and the attempt at representation. It's a very difficult thing, and that's something that I've struggled with trying to explain to people not within the community of why and why Discovery was so important and having that representation, and then why Discovery was so heartbreaking when that happened. It's
there's one queer character in Star Trek that technically canonically survives, but only if you follow the Kelvin timeline. Sulu's husband never actually passes in the timeline so far. So let's keep our fingers crossed. We don't need that kind of stress.
I will give you that. There, we've got some.
We've got one.
We've got one. We've got one, and that's a whole other bucket, whole other Pandora's box to open. Okay, so I'm with Cogenitor. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that episode, since it's one that has come up before?
Cogenitor is an episode where largely featuring, the A plot is about Charles Tucker III, Trip, discovering this ongoing in the inner workings of a species that, in order to reproduce, requires a third person, a cogenitor. The cogenitor is androgynous. It is a non-binary person. The cogenitors make up approximately 3% of the I think they were called
Vizian.
Yeah, of the Vizian population. Cogenitors are such a small percentage. It is justified. The culture justifies using them as sex slaves to pass them around to families that wish to reproduce. And these cogenitors do literally nothing else.
Yep.
They're just there for copulation. And so Trip gets in trouble when he tries to teach a cogenitor to read, and the cogenitor names themselves. They never identify specifically as a gender, although again, the cishet characters in the show have difficulty naming a non-binary character. I think this is such a terrific failure in writing, because for a long, long time, much longer than we've identified non-binary people, they and them have always been neutral terms for people who we didn't know the sex of. But characters in Star Trek pretend like that's not a thing that has ever been a thing. And So it's just from a writing standpoint, that seems like such a major failure to me, that you have this, you can't, anyway.
Now that comes up it's in the Outcast too, where it's like they refer to them as an it. And at least there's an attempt eventually. I think Trip starts to refer to the Cogenitor as a she, but like she never identifies as a she. She never comes out and says, I'm a woman. They just kind of, it looks like a woman, so it'll be a she.
Right.
Which is just frustrating.
And even Archer points out that it is rude to call the Cogenitor an it, like it's an object. But this more builds into the story they were trying to tell, which again gets back into, we've got this story about gender, but no, it's actually a story about something else.
Yeah, I called it as a story, an equal rights story, but it's not a successful equal rights story.
Right. Yeah. And the question then is like, who are these equal rights supposed to be for? So who is the Cogenitor coded to be? Which is the important part of the philosophy of the Star Trek episode, because there's certainly the philosophy question of, do we have the right to interfere with these species when they appear to be treating someone unethically? And I'd have to say that in this particular case, it was kind of ridiculous for Archer to hold Trip so responsible for pointing out that they've got this major societal flaw, because if you have 3% of your population, and I remember somebody did the math on this, that it was a crazy large number of people, a few million people at least, not doing anything, but sitting and eating and just sitting and sleeping and waiting to procreate. That is a massive amount of culture and production and just all of the things that an individual sentient being can do lost. 3, 4, 5, 12 million people. That's huge. And massively inefficient, especially for people that are supposed to be as efficient as the Vizians.
It really makes me question, even though they're not humans, their mental health.
Yeah.
Right.
There's no discussion there. It's like, this was to me, and I don't know that I pulled up notes for it or the wiki or anything. I thought I had, but it's like, it's an attempt to do something that very, very much fails, as you said. And aside from these basic things, it's just like, these people they'd go crazy. Like, just sitting in a room and barely interacting with other beings, like they would not be mentally healthy.
Especially because it was proven that they're just as intelligent as everyone else around them.
Right. Yeah. I just, that gets, that's not something that comes up. We're gonna make sure to talk about, how not all species are defined by two sexes, and
you're absolutely right. In fact, the Cogenitor displays signs of not being emotionally healthy. When Trip tries to teach them how to read, their first reaction was, no, I'm not allowed to read. And so they frequently, they're almost like a child. In that they know what's wrong, and they even say it when Trip brings them onto the Enterprise. Trip says, are you, I think, in fact, they ask, the Cogenitor asks, will you get in trouble for me being here? And he says, they'll get angry, but I won't get in trouble. And the Cogenitor says, well, I will get in trouble, but I don't want to leave. That's very much like what a 5-year-old would say if they knew they were doing something wrong. And another problem with that is that's also on Trip's side of things. That's really creepy, because that's grooming behavior for their power dynamic. And there was absolutely sexual tension there. And I think they tried to distract from that by giving Reed this go nowhere plot. I hated that was. I hated that.
Just so unnecessary.
It's the same thing as the Outcast. Like, had they spent a little more time developing the story, like you could have gotten rid of the C plot and the B plot in this episode, and formed it into this great episode, but they didn't. It was. I mean, I hate to like trash a Star Trek episode, on our positive podcast, but it's it's
still,
not. It's
a
not
good
an episode that lends well to the community.
I think it's a good episode, but it just failed to do what it set out to do. Yes, it does.
I really like the moment where they had just watched The Day the Earth Stood Still, and Trip like explains why humans had a hard time like trusting things, and like they would fight against things they didn't understand. Like I thought that moment was really good. I thought, although unnecessary, I really liked the ending when he gets scolded for doing, essentially violating another culture.
You want to see me, Captain?
I was just told that the Vissian Cogenitor died.
What? How?
Suicide trip. She killed herself.
That can't be. Why? It's my fault. I'm responsible.
You're damn right you are. There's not just her. There's a child who won't be conceived because of this. At least not for a long while. It's time you learned to weigh the possible repercussions of your actions. You've always been impulsive. Maybe this will teach you a lesson.
I understand.
Do you? I'm not so sure you do. You knew you had no business interfering with those people, but you just couldn't let it alone. You thought you were doing the right thing. I might agree if this was Florida or Singapore, but it's not, is it? We're in deep space, and a person is dead. A person who'd still be alive if we hadn't made first contact. I guess I haven't been very successful at getting through to you. If I had, you would have fought a lot harder before doing what you did.
You're not responsible.
Dismissed.
Captain?
But then that brings up a larger question, which both episodes don't address, is it right to accept a cultural belief that's different from your own, even if it feels fundamentally wrong?
Right. And there's certainly, like, that is a huge anthropological question, because there are things that we, in our culture largely don't accept, like, shrunken heads, for example. We don't accept that. And we don't accept it from other cultures either. So we encourage other cultures to sort of curtail this, no matter where it fits into their culture, because we believe that there's these ethics that supersede the ones that say that you should just let people be, which is then a double-edged sword in and of itself.
Right.
That gets used definitely against the queer community, as was demonstrated in the Outcast, because here were people that were convinced they were doing what was right for their people, and whereas I think the biggest failure in Cogenitor was when Archer met with the near the end, when Archer met with the captain and the family that had been given the Cogenitor after the Cogenitor had asked for asylum. There was no reason why the family should have been there, because they would have been far too emotionally charged to have a rational discussion, because clearly the two captains were still amicable and they still wanted to have a fair discussion of it. But instead we just got the couple making accusations, really clumsily written accusations at Archer.
Yeah, we never get the science of how, like, why the cogenitor is relevant to begin with, which is they try, and then Trip is like, no, I don't want to know. I would have liked to have known just to maybe better understand everything. Yeah. But I think it's reflective. Like, if you go look at the Star Trek wiki, the Outcast and the host both have notes talking about LGBTQ representation or homosexuality and representation. Cogenitor has nothing. Like, Cogenitor has no notes about that. It has no notes about gender representation. And, obviously, what was this, 92 when Cogenitor came out?
The Outcast was 92. Cogenitor was almost 10 years later.
Oh, 10 years. Okay, so wow. That's
2003.
even...
Yeah.
So, okay, sure. At that point, we weren't talking about gender in ways that we are now. They're not at this level anyway, not with this visibility. So I understand, especially with writers who, and I'm not going to assume, I don't know the identities of all these writers. I don't know them personally, but I think it's maybe safe to come to the assumption that this was an idea they were playing around with without really knowing anything about it. They're like, let's just put a third gender in there. And meanwhile, we already, like, when we talk about intersex people, two-spirit people, like, we already have people that don't conform to binary sex or binary gender.
Right.
So they didn't do any research. They didn't talk to any of those people. And they didn't really go anywhere with this, I think. And I've not heard many people talk about this episode in terms of sex trafficking. So I like that you brought that up, because I do think that that's a different way to talk about this episode instead of an emphasis on sex and gender. You'd think at this point in the future, again, with they and them even having been around forever, that this would be a non-issue. They would know, like, yeah.
Especially to Paul, because she's a Vulcan, and Vulcans are these super enlightened people. But she's, like, in the whole episode, shutting Trip down when she should be the one person on the ship who actually supports what he's trying to do.
To Paul was the one that said, "Why do you call it her?"
Right.
And then Phlox is also entirely unsupportive. Phlox backs up to Paul, and Phlox is another character who historically has been very open to all of the weirdness. Even in the episode, they start him being open to anything that's out of that normativity.
He has 3 wives.
Yeah.
He's the one that says not all species are united by 2 sexes, and then I don't know if I saved the other quote, but he's talking about, well, be open-minded, and and
be open-minded, but don't mess with them.
It's like the denobulins themselves are polyamorous, and as a poly person, and it befuddles me that I haven't really gone back and paid a lot of attention to how his polyamory or polygamy was represented.
I look forward to that episode of QueerTrek.
We will get there. I got to find other poly people to bring on to talk about it. I know, like, women at Warp feel like the polyamory there, the polygamy was brought in more as a joke. That it's not something that's taken seriously or used in a serious manner. And so when I go back and rewatch some of these episodes, I'm going to pay extra special attention, because when I've watched Enterprise in the past, I didn't identify as poly. I didn't understand that aspect of who I am. And now I do. So it's something that I look forward to analyzing and talking about in the future.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things that are covered in this way, especially what I see is a lot of it comes from a misunderstanding of where feminism actually was in the 90s and early 2000s. And there's this honest attempt, because this is where the social future is at as far as they can tell, but it's almost like if someone just went on a Tumblr blog and read like one specific Tumblr blog and then went, okay, I now understand SJWs, I can represent them accurately on a television show or something. It's just it's not it's half the work, and it's not supported by any academics or actual experience.
I think the best way to put it is that Cogenitor is a hot mess.
Absolutely.
It really is. And I think that a lot of people struggle with it. Again, it doesn't, it attempts to discuss gender. It fails.
And again, we have a woman who is cast as an androgynous person, because culturally we're taught that to be androgynous, you must appear more, you must be a femme person that presents masculine. You can't be a masculine person that presents feminine, because either that's a trans woman or a drag queen. And it's not the other way around. And that totally closes off this whole population of non-binary people who were assigned male at birth, or who simply may have developed with more testosterone than estrogen, because there's no doubt that the hormones influence the way that our bodies shape. But that's not necessarily the way our gender shapes.
I think that, moving towards the future, since we've got Discovery, we're getting more Discovery, we're getting the Picard series, we're getting more Star Trek. It would be great if we do explore subjects of gender and stuff like that, to like have people that actually identify as non-binary or a trans woman. Like, again, we fall into, what was it, the movie that like Scarlett Johansson was gonna play a trans woman or something, and you can't have it's like you can't put
trans man.
Just
that
like
movie had all kinds of problems with it in general.
Now that and still, as far as how many trans actors get cast in trans roles, like that's a whole other episode. But people are out.
I'd love to see Laverne Cox on Star Trek.
Yes, absolutely. Like, I hope that we get, real actors playing them. Well, not real actors. That's not right. I hope that we get actors representing their, okay. How do I better say that? That doesn't sound just flat.
We hope we get actors who can accurately represent the role that they are playing.
Yes.
Through life experience, and not just not just interpretation of life.
That brings up just a thought about Discovery, because Tig Notaro is going to be in season 2. So I wonder if she's going to be playing a lesbian character.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
I think the thing that I would like to see out of Discovery, if they do decide to cover gender as a topic at all, I don't want the gender non-conforming person to be an alien. I understand the use of them being an alien from the perspective, but if you're going to use an alien, just code it and it'll be fine. But they can absolutely have a transgender person on
in Starfleet,
in Starfleet, and I love that there's always this person that gets pointed to in like the first or second episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, someone with a masculine frame walking around in a scant, and it's just one of the background characters, but they're always pointed to as like, oh look, there's a trans person in Star Trek. Which isn't to say that you have to have a masculine frame to be a trans person.
No, not at all.
So here's my take on that. That character, my understanding was Gene just wanted representation of everyone can wear a scant. Again, we're in the future where none of it matters. However, if someone does see that character and, if there's a trans man that identifies with that character as a trans man, then I think that's great.
Yeah. And that actor had great legs.
He did.
I think that is important. And that, again, is part of why we're doing this podcast, is because sometimes people find representation in places that others don't. And I think that is valid. And that, just like with people on the spectrum, seeing Tilly as also being on the spectrum or neuroatypical, I think that is valid and that's powerful. And that's part of why we love Star Trek. Okay. Do we have any other topics or final thoughts?
When there's a question, whenever you question what someone's gender is, there's two ways that you can handle it that are polite. You can either ask politely, which is also helpful if you introduce yourself with your own pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, nice to meet you. My name is Felicity. My pronouns are she, her.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually invites someone to offer their pronouns as well.
Yeah.
Or you can just be quiet about it and wonder.
Yeah.
If you can survive that level of curiosity, if it's even relevant to you to know what their gender is. And more often than not, this is framed by men who don't consider trans women viable candidates for sex. And so they're trying to determine if a trans woman is a viable candidate for sex.
Yeah.
Which is an awful reason to need to know somebody's gender.
Right.
I just threw up in my mouth a little. I think that's why we're talking about this stuff. Okay, Marty, any thoughts from you?
I mean, I just hope that one day everybody gets the representation that they deserve in Star Trek. Whether it be like a whole storyline or just a character who has like one scene. I mean, anything at this point would be better than what we've gotten so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We need some positive, happy endings for the queer folk in Star Trek.
And I mean, I think if Discovery ever gets like back to kind of these maybe one-off episodes in between the larger storyline, like Enterprise season 3 did, then maybe we can get these kind of stories told.
I think there's room for that. I think that Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad is a good example of a standalone story within the greater
context.
narrative.
Yeah. And I think they're working towards that too. I think they've said they're trying to work towards that. So
yeah. And I do have hope. To me, the way that Discovery's written, the things that they've discussed, the allegories they've included are progressive. And we do have minority representation. We have women representation. We have LGBTQ representation. There was a character who was in a wheelchair. And there was more than just Stamets and Culber. There were two women dancing together that looked very intimate in the background. And I think it was in Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad.
Yes.
So I feel hopeful that we will get that kind of representation. I'm curious to see what happens with Tig Notaro's character. I know her name is like Jet, or like that was her nickname. I can't remember what her full character name was or will be. But I do have hope. And again, this will not be the first time that we talk about the 4 or 5 episodes of Star Trek with queer representation. So we don't want to be completely repetitive, but again, everyone processes these episodes differently. Everyone, even as you said, Felicity, like with Janeway, you can find Janeway in instances where you think, she may be a trans woman, and we want to hear it. We want to talk about that. Like, I want to hear all those perspectives. Everyone interprets Star Trek in different ways. And it's, as far as I know, hasn't been done from a queer perspective. So that's something that I look forward to in the future for sure. And we welcome feedback on this episode. I I said at the top of the show all the ways to find us. So please send us a note, send us a tweet, let us know what you think. And in the meantime,
let us know what you want us to talk about too.
Yes. We have more episodes in the works, but we're still accepting submissions all the time. We do want to remain a monthly podcast, so that means there's a bit of a waiting list, but we will make time for everyone. It's that we're not going away. So I guess thank you, Felicity, for joining us and adding your voice to QueerTrek. Where can people find you should they want to continue the conversation or just be your friend because you're awesome?
You can find me on Twitter at RadMissFliss. That's FLISS.
Yay!
And I will be there just doing Twitter stuff.
All right. And Marty, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at TimeTravelMarty. Heather?
I am also on the Twitters at LLAPOSPER, which is LLAPAWSPER. We are at QueerTrek Pod. We are QueerTrek.thetriquartertransmissions.com, and find us on Patreon, patreon.com/thetriquartertransmissions. We will be back sooner rather than later in a month.
We absolutely will.
So I forget who gave us the suggestion on how to close the show, and I'm sorry, and I will make sure to find your name for
But we did find it.
Yes.
And I'm excited about it.
So we know how to close the show now, and that is by saying live, love, and prosper. Thank you so much. I will credit you next episode. I promise. We love you all, and we will see you soon.